I'm Coop. I'm going to show you how to integrate a rough cut into the Rapidstrike without using any glues. This is nice because it's hardware only, which means you don't have to paint the blaster. This is actually finished, and I think it looks mad. I lost my unboxing clips, but the first step is to open up the blasters out of the box and actually disassemble them and just work it down to the shell so the internals aren't in the way. Next thing we've got to do is cut the rough cut shell in order for it to fit onto the Rapidstrike and for the magazine well to work. How you cut the shell is going to be dependent on whether or not you want to keep your trigger. You can cut the rough cut shell here and then glue down the trigger internally. I'm choosing not to do that, so I'm going to have it a little bit further forward in order to have an operational trigger. So again, your line might vary a little bit. If you want to be on the safe side, cut a little bit too far that way, and you can always sand a little too far off. If you cut too far this way, you can't put that plastic back on, obviously. You're also going to have to trim the top little nub up here in order for that to fit up along the rail. So I'm just using a back saw. If you have a miter saw, that would be really easy to make sure you get a good square, consistent cut, but mine's in storage, so I'm using a hand saw. So I'm cleaning up some of the burrs with my X-Acto knife. Looks a little bit better. I just cleaned that up with an X-Acto blade to get some of the burrs out. Now I'm going to run over the edges with some 150 grit sandpaper real lightly. Try not to sand the shell if you're not going to paint the blaster. I'm not painting it, so I'm not just going to randomly sand everywhere. I'm really only sanding the slightly uneven bits. So I'm done sanding. It's pretty smooth. I'm definitely happy with the finish. It would be ready for painting. If you're going to paint it, I'm not painting mine, so I'm leaving it like that. So we have this cut and the top cut off now, but the last thing we need to do is either cut off this ledge or this little area. I'm choosing to cut off this because I believe it'll look a little cleaner. So once again, I'm going to line it up with my permanent marker and just hack off just a little sliver there to allow the rest of the rough cut to sit up against the Rapidstrike. So the next step after you've fitted everything is to actually secure them, and the best way to do that is to attach them with hardware or screws. We're going to actually drill some holes into both of the rails that match with each other, so the screws will attach to both shells really smoothly. So these lines actually denote where I'm going to drill, and then it's going to be also on the center line, which is sort of difficult to drill actually, but it is actually essential for this type of mounting system. There are tons of ways you can get two guns to secure to each other, but this is how I'm doing it for this example. So the next thing we're doing is marking up the rough cuts rail in order to match up to these holes. And again, I'm using this little, the end strike tooth right here as another hole for the slot for the tooth. So I have 4 holes here, and then if you line it up, get a permanent marker, and you put lines on this to correspond to align wherever you'd like the rough cut. Even though these permanent marker marks are not really even visible once it's assembled, I'm still going to wipe it off. Again, isopropyl alcohol on a rag, and just wipe it off, and as you can see, it's gone. Repeat on the rough cut, and you're good to go. Alrighty, so we have the holes drilled for the Rapidstrike and the rough cut, which obviously correspond with each other. And the next part is probably going to trip up the most people out of all of these steps. It's really not that difficult though, if you can understand it, which I'm going to try to explain to prevent the misunderstanding. Okay, so traditionally when you bolt two surfaces together, you typically put them together, drill a hole, and then bolt them together. We are essentially bolting these together, however, it does separate on the center line, as I keep saying over and over, which just sort of trips up what exactly you're doing. So you actually are putting your bolt through your nut before you actually assemble anything, which is rather unique to this modification. So you space your bolt appropriately to the gap you're doing, which I'm not going to measure that, but you can just line it up. And you're trying to space it so it pinches in and actually holds them together tightly. If it's too loose, you're going to have some wobble. If it's too tight, you're either going to be flexing your plastic or it simply won't be assembled at all. play around with this and try to adjust it by fractions of a millimeter at a time, and then eventually get it set, and then do all of your bolts the same spacing. It's not going to be set up in a way that would make one of them twice as long. That's not how it is. All of them are the same length. So after you have them set up, you can actually just set them in there for the assembly. I find it easier to put the nut on the rough cut side just because there's a battery tray going in here and I don't want to run into the nut or anything like that. So you can either set them in here, or what's actually easier is to set them all into the rough cut and shut the rough cut and complete it, and then assemble the Rapidstrike after, which I'll show you. This is method 1, which you would then shut the plastic in. That would work. So instead of dealing with the alignment on both simultaneously, it is much easier just to put the bolts in one of the blasters. The rough cut's a little easier because the heads are in the top and the nuts are in the bottom, which are just a little easier to deal with. And then you align this and you shut it, and it's a whole lot faster and much easier to coordinate because dealing with the moving bolts is kind of annoying. If you're encountering issues with the stability of your integration, like excessive wobble or excessive movement in any direction, make sure the screws surrounding your rails are as tight as possible. These two screws are very important to make sure they're very tight, so there's very little side-to-side play in your screws, and if you drilled your holes too big or they're sloppily drilled and the screws can move, that will also create excessive shifting, which makes your integration a little sloppy and a little loose. So after you screw both of the shells together, it should look something like this. So operation of the rough cut remains the same. You prime the blaster and pull the trigger. If that gets a little annoying and you want it to be a slam fire only, you can always add a zip tie around the trigger. So you can see there's a zip tie on the trigger now. So right when the handle hits the forward position, it automatically fires. That's a little bit more convenient in my opinion, but sometimes you want to have it primed and ready to go. So yep, that's it. The tutorial is really for anybody who's curious. Hopefully, if you wanted to learn how to do it, now you know how. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the section below and I'll hopefully get back to you.